The Middle Passage was this gruesome, harrowing, deathly experience in which captured Africans were brought to this country against their will across the Atlantic Ocean.
The transatlantic slave trade really starts in the 15th century. Europeans are beginning to acquire navigational techniques that would let them go over long-distance sail travel. They are trying initially to get access to goods, and particularly to gold, that they know exists in sub-Saharan Africa. But as that's taking place, of course, the other long-distance explorations take them across the Atlantic to the Western Hemisphere. They introduce the plantation system of labor in order to extract crops of various kinds and precious metals of various kinds. And initially they're using Native American labor for that, but they also have enslaved labor that's available from different parts of Africa.
These enslaved Africans would be brought to different countries along the Atlantic sea line. So if they were coming from the continent of Africa, specifically the West Coast, I want to make that incredibly clear, specifically the West Coast. So that's Ghana, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, Senegal, and the list goes on, and brought them here to not only the U.S., so that includes North America, South America, as well as Caribbean islands. And then as you continue to bring them down south, they would, end up in Brazil and places of that nature. And they literally are packed like sardines. You don't have enough room to throw bows and stretch out. There's none of that. And you're packed one on top of each other. It's like a suitcase at the bottom of an airplane, and it's just like literally stacked and stacked and stacked on top of each other, which also brought about incredible disease. Food was scarce, if there was food at all, and it was food that, there was some familiarity with, but then it was at times it would be totally alien to you. So there were dietary issues that, weren't being addressed as well. You're not feeding them properly. Let's say you're carrying a good 1,500 slaves on a ship, crossing from, let's say, the west coast of Africa, coming across the U.S. There's a good chance that maybe a good 300 to 500, give or take, may not make the journey to the Americas.
Slavery in Africa, it's an institution that had been in many parts of the world, including Africa, for centuries. And Europeans begin to increasingly demand Africans to be transported across the Atlantic to be put to work on plantations. And so over the course of time, that gradually increases and becomes really the reason that Europeans are looking to trade with Africa. They're looking for enslaved laborers. Most Africans are become susceptible to being enslaved through being taken as prisoners in war. We have in our minds that there's, Europeans go into Africa and just start kidnapping people. That did happen, but by and large, it is rulers of various African nations and African kingdoms who are selling their defeated enemies into slavery because it gets rid of them, right? You knew that they would not come back if you sold them. Now, over the course of time, that does start to change, right? There are obviously internal dynamics to West and Central Africa that create circumstances for warfare, but as the demand of Europeans for slaves increases, that also has the capacity to produce warfare, where you have different ethnic groups in Africa who will go to war with each other, knowing that slaves are going to be a byproduct of that war. You have various African rulers who might fall into debt, and the only way to pay off that debt is with captive Africans, and so that is another incentive for taking people prisoner and selling them into slavery. So, the dynamics of how African captives are produced for the transatlantic slave trade is in part a product of the internal dynamics of West and Central African societies, and in part pressures that are coming externally from European trade. And what's different really about the transatlantic trade is that slavery in Africa is not usually chattel slavery, right? It's not people are being taken into slavery for the purpose of necessarily exploiting their labor for life. It's not always inheritable. That's really what's new and what's different about slavery in the Western Hemisphere, is that it's chattel slavery, it's lifelong, it's handed down from generation to generation, and it's mostly for the purposes of labor exploitation. And so that really carries on for several centuries. By the 18th century, which is really the peak of the transatlantic trade, by the time the plantation system is really sort of fully implemented in the Americas, roughly 6 million Africans are brought out of Africa and taken to the Western Hemisphere for the purpose of serving as slaves.